Welcome to the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we have the opportunity to visit with an extraordinary scholar and cultural expert, Soraya Afzali. Soraya, it is so good to visit with you. Thank you.
Thanks to you, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to be on this podcast.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure, and I know we're going to dive into some topics very salient for our current global situation. You come from Afghanistan. You're currently working on a PhD based in Dublin, Ireland, and you are studying the role of charismatic leadership as it relates to despotism, autocracy, the types of leaders emergent that are not necessarily at all good for society, good for humanity, good for our world.
Yes, I'm a fourth-year PhD student here at Trinity College, Dublin. And as you mentioned, my research focus is charisma and overall charismatic authority, and as part of that, charismatic leadership. One of the main focus area, my focus area is to understand how charismatic authority actually works, how it manifests itself, in which kind of setting, and as a recipient of this authority, ultimately, what should we be aware of?
Okay, wonderful. I'm really excited to dive into this with you. Obviously, so important for all of us. Soraya Afzali received her bachelor's degree in business management at the American University of Afghanistan and her master's in international relations from Central European University. Soraya has several years of experience in communication and has contributed to different research projects with international organizations as a consultant. She has contributed to the World Bank Group's Education Management Information System in collaboration with Ministry of Higher Education and GIZ's Monitoring, Evaluation, and Communication in collaboration with Ministry of Economics in Afghanistan. And GIZ is a German-based humanitarian organization. Soraya is passionate about promoting diversity and inclusion. For her master's thesis, she focused on mechanisms of inclusion in educational systems. Within her volunteer work, she has volunteered for Solace for the Children, the American Councils, and co-founded Humans of Kabul in 2013 to tell stories of Afghan people. Throughout the years, Soraya has been part of different networks that focus on civil society empowerment, such as Open Society Foundation, initiatives of change in the Co-Scholars Program, and the Luciel Foundation, which of course, Soraya, is how we met. She is the recipient of the United States Embassy Scholarship and Open Society Leadership Award. And Soraya, you and I, we've had an opportunity over the last few months to have a few really deep and lovely conversations about the work that you're doing, work that is taking on some very challenging and difficult topics. And I'm so thrilled we have the opportunity to share your wisdom, your knowledge, and your insights with our audience, because it's something you're focused on, something that is so vitally important to the fabric of the societies and the global society in which we're all participants and we're all connected. And so I guess, to kick things off, let me just ask you, why charisma? Why a focus on charisma in your work and your research? And how did you come to a focus on charisma and charismatic leadership?
Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for such a kind introduction. The answer to this question, I can do it in two parts, or from two perspectives. One is personal, and the other is rather theoretical and academic. And I will tackle the academic one first. Charismatic authority is interesting because it can be both rational and it can be irrational. It doesn't have any framework to work with, compared to other kinds of authority that has been theorized by sociologists, to name one of the prominent one, Max Weber, which are, for example, bureaucratic authority or legal authority that deals with laws and policies and paperwork and so on. But the charismatic authority does not rely on any of these. It's almost like a fluid type of authority that can exist within the bureaucracy, within the legal sphere, or it can exist quite purely. Um, and this is why it becomes interesting because there is no standard of framework that it can be implemented by. And if somebody who is prone to be convinced through charismatic authority will be, um, no matter if the idea is probable or pragmatic or logical or not. So this is why I find charismatic authority interesting, and specifically its role in propagation of hate. I think there's a strong element in here that needs to be developed further. And the other part of my answer to your question um, is of course personal, and it comes back to me doing what I do and why I do it. In my research, I focus on hate against immigrant communities, and this can be interpreted in many ways, taken from racism to bureaucracy to different structural systems of hate that is present against immigrant communities. And with immigrant communities, I mean immigrants in Europe, immigrants, in part of the region where I come from, and currently, worldwide. I was born as an immigrant, and therefore these experiences of hate in the form of exclusion was rather normalized a state of being for me as a child, as a grown-up person, and even now here in Ireland. So what makes this work? What makes us still rely on these forms of hate and exclusion, and still carry on, and how do we not question that? And I think there's a matter of influence that happens in here. So this is why I ended up researching this authority, because it also has this personal dimension of rather exploration from my side. Yeah, so briefly, that would be my answer for this.
Yeah, and there's so much to dive in here in the academic theoretical side of things. Um, but before going there, I want to ask, because I've been really fascinated by Afghanistan in particular, and I think in part because I'm here in Colorado, and some of the landscape is actually very similar. Although obviously much of the culture is probably quite different in some respects. Um, I want to ask you, what's it like, that relationship with Afghanistan, which has a rugged mountainous landscape, compared to a place like Ireland, where you are, that is like softer and greener and often raining. It's very different climates and geographies. I was just wondering if you could share a little with us, just from your personal perspective and experience, the ways maybe that you relate to those two different places.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there's a couple of things that comes to my mind. I absolutely agree that Colorado is, in fact, like Afghanistan, the landscape. There's elements of weather that is quite similar. And I think I strongly felt that when I was in Colorado. And from your question, what comes to me is the perception of home. What does that actually mean? Moving between spaces, um, from landscape to internal feelings, from immigration to displacement, to all these different experiences. Um, One of the things that I have realized is that home is a space within. It's quite internal, and to have kind of obsession over wanting to be home or wanting to have a particular setup that signifies home. I believe is not a quite healthy perspective to go about it. And I want to take myself as an example. If I am in Ireland and I still think about Afghanistan, which I do in so many ways, but I have decided that this place of home is something that I keep within myself. It could be a smell, it could be the smell of the bread, it could be like the breeze of the spring, the smell of the flower. And those things are the sentiment of life, are mostly what I resonate with as home. And this notion has made me quite flexible and at ease to move between spaces. And this is how I am in Ireland as well. As an Afghan, as somebody who has lost home and country over and over, being a 1990s kid. It's the second time that I have lost my home and my country. And from 1996, where the Taliban took over Afghanistan, all the way to 3 years ago, 2021, the generation that worked on different areas, different improvements within Afghanistan and country was and is my generation. So things that we have lost now is a loss for people like me, whose teenagehood, whose bachelor's degree time, master's degree time, higher education time was spent really working on institutional building and building that strong network of young generation leadership and leaders. And to lose that is not something that is easy to live with. He being here in Ireland, I'm grateful for many things, while carrying this sense of home within myself, but also knowing that whatever I do, even my work, even my conversation with you today, remains as a form of resistance. For a better world, for a better living that is not separate and remains interconnected.
Mm-hmm. It's really really beautiful, and for me lands as wisdom the way you speak about home being within, and it reminds me of hearing from I think many luminaries a sense that the entire world is our home and we all share it, and to combine that with this experience of home within I think is very powerful. And as maybe a segue into the deep academic research and theoretical work you're doing around this topic of charismatic leadership and the way it can mobilize hatred, racism, xenophobia, and exclusion, I'm struck that oftentimes that kind of charismatic leadership links with a sense of geographic territory, right? Whether it was Hitler talking about the Blut und Boden, the blood and soil of the German identity, or In many countries right now today, this major concern around border security, right, is taking on all kinds of dimensions and affecting different people in all kinds of ways. I'm wondering, in your work, looking at how charismatic leadership can ultimately lead to terrible violence and tragedy, do you see a very strong link to a sense of geographic territoriality, or is that more of an occasional or coincidental link?
Yes, I think all of these factors are quite contributing to how charismatic authority works. And it's more almost like tactic that is being used. And this tactic, like doesn't have to be somebody like Hitler for us to realize it, that okay, he was charismatic and he was able to convince such a strong number of crowds to follow him. This tactics can happen from a low scale to a large scale. It can happen between two people, two thousands, and within crowds, and so forth. The one determining factor that makes charisma works is that an interaction needs to happen. There needs to be two people interacting. In the leadership world, it is known as the follower and the leader, because for example, somebody can be charismatic, and if they do not interact with other people, their charisma might never be discovered. So this is why this element of interaction can be, is the very first and foremost important thing in manifestation of charismatic authority. Now, returning back to your question, and whether geography and race and these elements are contributing to this authority manifestation, absolutely yes. But they function as a way to rationalize certain arguments, to rationalize the argument of the person who uses their charisma. This is why, whether the initial point is logical or not does not matter, or rational or irrational does not matter. But they use these geographical arguments to back their argument up. For example, we take the Taliban. The Taliban, their fight is based on a charismatic authority, because it's a matter of influence for people to be part of their group, to be part of their movement, and this is backed by religion. It's backed by politics, which has its own regional political situation, and so forth. We can dive deeper into this if we wanted. But to give an European example, let's take, for instance, Orban. He's one of the most far right and considerably charismatically counted charismatic in Central Europe. And he is known to be one of the people who is far right, who is pro-Christian and anti-immigrant. And there has been many analysis of his speeches as well, in relation to different tactics he uses. So one of the ways he goes on about it is to use the religion of Christianity as a starting point, that yes, we are Europe, we are Christian, and we are threatened by the immigrants. And to put forward this very general statement, you're in the middle and open to interpretation, is the core of this problem. First of all, for what is European? European consists of many, many diverse amount of diverse background of people coming together. Christianity itself has diversity, but to generalize these terms and instrumentalize it within politics this in itself is a tactic of charisma. You curate a sense of enemy. You say this is your enemy and this is what you should do. And within the framework of emotions of charisma, this is a process that is known as evoking, evoking a sense of emotion. And what better than religion to evoke a sense of emotion, something that is very uh, personal, but also very public and can be practiced in both ways. Um, and this evoking, is one of the ways of going on about it. And after a sense of enemy is constructed, then the second stage would be, in accordance to the emotions of charisma, is revoking, a stage. And revoking is when the change of hearts happen. When people realize, for example, if I am in Hungary and I see this surge of immigrants coming into the country, and as a person, I'm like, oh, okay, he's actually right. There are people showing up in the country that look different from us, have different religion, have different culture. So it must be these people that this politician is talking about. So this is where the change of hearts happen. This is where the central point of argument happens, where people no longer see themselves as any end of a victim or a non-partisan people, but decide to do something about it. They gain a sense of agency, a sense of urgency is also created. And this is what I like, about analyzing emotions of charisma. And by the way, this framework is by Patricia L. From the 1980s, based on an article she has written, and she also describes these very clearly by analyzing different speeches. And she says the last stage is reframing, and when reframing happens, particular leaders that use these tactics and have this element of charisma reframe the situation for people. And reframing is a plan to action, like, so if you believe me what I said, and if you strongly resonate with it, here is a plan of action for me. Here is how you can vote. Here is how you can have more Hungarian children. Here is how you can you know contribute this for this certain agenda that this particular politician, Orban, for example, has. Um, so I want to circle back because we talked about, tactics, emotions, um, sense of enemy, political agenda, all of this. But again, what is charisma? Is it a quality? Is it something that people can learn? Is it, um, how does it work? Okay, these tactics work, and they're in place. So the answer to that is that it is both. It is a quality that a person has based on, different relationships, how they evolved in life. And it's also a rhetoric, meaning that it can be learned, it can be practiced to perfection. It's For Orban, it's all about, having this, wearing this suit that looks like somebody who is a businessman, who gets things done, who is, goes to job, and at the same time appearing as a person who goes and talk to the local people, with the butcher, with the shopkeeper, um, with the supermarket people, with, like slaughtering a pig with the local people. And he does all of these activities, and they're curated very carefully. They are distributed among people through different channels of social media, particularly for a certain purpose. That this is the guy to vote for. This is the guy that can lead us further. And this is exactly how charisma works, to create that sense of first threat and being threatened, and then rescuing somebody from that state of being. And this is how it functions, how, and you can see that, okay, it can be related, it can instrumentalize religion in this particular case that we talked about. It can instrumentalize many other, way of being. It can instrumentalize economy, the region, politics of region. It instrumentalizes wars, like, one can go ahead and analyze Orban's relationship with Russia and Ukraine, and all these different dimensions. They all become a contributing factor, for these manifestation of like tactics and so forth.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So in Viktor Orban, I understand currently is Prime Minister of Hungary. Is that his position?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I want to back up 1 minute here, because when you and I began speaking together several months ago, and we initially were talking about charismatic leadership, what came to mind for me were figures like Gandhi or Martin Luther King, or even some of the greatest luminaries that have led to entire global religious movements, like Jesus or Muhammad or Gautama Siddhartha the Buddha or Confucius. And I think of in other like historical contexts, charismatic leaders like Winston Churchill or Ben Franklin. How do you, and what's ironic to me in all of this is that so many of the most charismatic, who seem to be oriented around love and kindness and wisdom and humanitarianism, often the religions, the institutions, the movements created in the wake of those individual impulses then later on get twisted and turned into very dark and sinister forms of charismatic leadership and mobilizing people. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is how the heck do we understand the difference between a charismatic leadership that is working in service to humanity genuinely, authentically, and a charismatic leadership that is contrary to that? And I ask again, I think we can point to some of the most stark, maybe black and white examples, but I'm wondering, even in today's politics in many nations of the world, we've got figures where some of my friends and family would say, oh, that person I think is mobilizing hatred or xenophobia, while another friend or family member would say, no, that's my person, that's my guy, that charismatic leader speaks on my behalf, right? And so how the heck do we tease all of this apart?
Yeah. Yes. Charismatic authority can be used for both good and bad, equally. It can go to any direction. To notice or to realize its potential for propagation of hate is the nature of manipulation. It is we always have to, and I talk in the political and religious context because I study instrumentalization of religion in politics. So when one mixes politics and religion, there is always an agenda behind this. There is this whole setting is a field open to manipulation. And I think this is the first, dichotomy that we have to notice, that what is happening, between this intersection. The second thing that we can notice is the element of history. How our history has been used and for what purposes. Is it used to unify, or is it used to bring more separation that brings hatred? and this can happen on different levels, of course. You know, for example, stories behind religion, even, if one, scrutinize Christianity or Islam, both of them, there is many segments between among the two religion, and many contradictions, and sects, and different disciplines that disagree with each other. But we need to pay attention that which one of these are proposed to me to evoke or to uh, threaten me, to create a sense of enemy. This is the first stage that, we need to pay attention. For example, this whole issue of, immigrants, and Christianity, and Muslim immigrants, and so forth, which is one example. And then the the alternative, what has been, offered to us, we need to also pay attention to that. What kind of framing, what kind of agenda is being put forward, and who benefit from it, and what goes on. And I know that these things are not, quite, easy, and for our daily life to always pay attention to. But to question these constantly and I think we are arriving at a stage that we always have to question these. And if we do not, we are simply contributing to this build-up of system that we no longer can, control. And I think questioning these and is the way to go on about it. Um, and also, I think, personally, the more I study, religious radicalization in this process that happens individually and within groups, from Taliban to far right in Europe, and I'm sure equivalents also exist in the US. Um, the manipulation through religion is a very sensitive state of being, because it deals with sacred values of people that are very individual and are very personal. Um, and when you threaten people's sacred values, whatever that is, whether it is religious or not, you take away something from them. You take away a sense of belonging from them. And these sacred values needs to um, come within a framework of not only respect, but out of politics completely. And this is the beginning of, how we can promote more unity, where we have shared goals for a better coexistence and co-living and life. Um, and and this element of belonging is very important in here as well, in relation to sacred values, because I belong first to myself through my own sacred values, within Christianity, within Islam, within, my home, whatever that is. And this belonging is how I function in the world. This is how I find people like my own self, who have the same values, and how I become a member of a group, and how I create a sense of, being, how I develop ethics, morality, all of that. It happens among group, it happens among communities. And it is this sensitive, this fragile, state that has been manipulated, within our political system. And the instrument that has pioneered this manipulation is in fact religion. Um, and more so, like in 2024, of course, if we go back to the history, you know religion and politics has always been, mixed together. But we live in a world where the world is becoming smaller and connected more and more, where asking somebody where are you from no longer makes sense, because of the migration, and you have the climate migration coming our way if we do not pay attention to these things. So we need to take a moment and notice that okay, there is an alternative approach to this, and that is to separate the two, the politics and the religion, and not and make sure everybody's sacred values are respected, in some ways and equally, ideally.
Yeah. Excuse me. Wow, there's so much to unpack here. My mind is going in two different directions, and I want to mention one thing that strikes me as very ironic. You just mentioned climate refugees, and I know that many of the world's intelligence and military and policy communities have been looking at potential forecasted scenarios over the next few decades, and I've heard and seen models that anticipate upwards of 700 million to 1 billion individual human beings displaced by climate events. And I think one of the great ironies, at least thinking about some of the political lines in this country, is that for folks who are really concerned about something like borders getting overwhelmed by refugees, one of the best things they probably could do is take a very proactive stance on climate change mitigation, ironically. And politically, those two don't necessarily tend to go together right now, it seems. So that was just maybe a side thought that I'm having, but I'm wondering, I'm almost thinking that, we could see a little handbook that could help each one of us better understand, hey, am I susceptible to charismatic authoritarianism? Because my sense is that when we're not very aware of the fact that we likely are. And I wonder, from as much of an objective standpoint as possible, how do we outline or delineate or even guide somebody through a process of self-examination and critical thinking? And perhaps, a lot of times when folks have the privilege and opportunity of formal education, higher education, these kinds of skills are inculcated as a matter of course in the curricula. But for many of us, those are not the pathways we experience. So I'm thinking out loud, and I'm thinking about an organization like the Luciel Foundation, where you and I met, Soraya, and there are so many amazing, inspiring, heart-centered leaders connected through that amazing network. And my sense is that I don't get this sense that the leaders in that organization are moving in a direction of charismatic authoritarianism, right? And so it's a two-part question. Like, as leaders, how do we know we're not going down a pathway toward authoritarianism? And as individual global citizens of the world, how do we know our degree of vulnerability or likelihood to fall prey to that kind of leadership?
Yeah. I think I would like to return back to the element of belonging, and hopefully I'm not stretching the answer to this question too far. But I keep on jumping between my analysis of Europe and also the Taliban, because this is the two segments that I'm focused on. And I want to mention that, Taliban being recognized as a very fundamental, radical group that propagate hate quite actively, is nothing that is, hidden from the world, And their degree of radicalization also happens through a process of charismatic authority, influence, um, and being convinced to do jihad, being convinced to fight for religion. And this obviously happens among groups and on individual basis as well. But but one might question that why a person is being influenced by this authority. And the answer to that is the sense of belonging, because there is somebody, the in the network of the Taliban, that offers a sense of belonging to a person that has nowhere to go, that doesn't belong in Afghanistan, that no longer fits in the society, and has been, through education, of radicalization and certain in certain ways, in certain based on certain curriculum, has ended up there. And the very first um, process of influence happens by imagining this sense of belonging. Okay, I've got this, and this is where I belong. And this happens in, on any scale. It's not very specific to Taliban, it's not specific to the concept of Afghanistan. um so how do we imagine a better version of this, where there is no radicalization and hate in between? And one of the ways to go on about it is to look at it as a community building, that there's no longer a leader, no longer a central figure to be followed, but it, like, the community moves as a community in a collective way. um and I'm sure if this alternative agenda would have been put in place even for Taliban, even in the context of Afghanistan, it would have had a different outcome. But the problem is that they have um, this imagination, or rather interpretation of certain leader, that this is how one should be, this is the way to go. And there's many other political contributing factor into this, which I'm not gonna delve into. But to coming back to Europe, coming back to a more, non-individual setting, how do we prevent authoritarian? How do we prevent, radicalism of any kind and all of that? And I think for this, people need a shared goal, and I just want to mention, and I want to trigger the mind of whoever is listening to replace religion with climate change in politics. Perceptions change. It's through religion that people have, politicians have constantly constructed sense of enemies, that it has been instrumentalized, because our leaders, our political leaders, more so in Europe, like, lack a reflection on the collective goal, collective challenge that we have. If you want, if you want to be counselor, or in the parliament, or a politician, you have to convince people, and for this you need a plan, and for that plan to work, you need to come from a certain background. You have to be white, you have to be Christian, and you have to be, or person of color, or coming from this country, and the list goes on. And one of the things that is missing in here, and one of the reasons that our politicians have ended up in this way, is because of the lack of a shared and collective goal. And when we have that, I think we have an approach and a proper agenda to follow that. And nothing at this moment is better than taking care of climate change, taking care of like our planet, making our systems more inclusive and better. And I think this should be our goal. And none of this happen singularly. It all happens collectively. It all happens as people and communities coming together. Even if we have one leader that directs all of this, again, there will be a problem because it's just one person. So it has so much potential to end up autocratic, and so forth. So it's more about shifting approach, changing our goals, changing our agenda, and questioning these things and asking these difficult questions continuously. That you know that how do we approach life? Because at the end of the day, we all want to belong. This person who is being radicalized in any religion, in any setting, at the end of the day wanted to belong somewhere. And as a society, we have not provided that space of belonging for this particular person who have been radicalized. And we need to question that why have we ended up in here? And how can we turn that around? How can we change that? So that would be my answer to your question.
Mhm. Wow. So much to ponder and to consider. I want to remind our audience this is the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron William Perry, and today we are visiting with Soraya Afzali, a scholar and expert on charismatic authoritarianism based in Dublin, Ireland, where she's currently working on her PhD at Trinity College. I want to be sure to mention that we've got a few ways you can connect with Soraya and her work. We'll include a link to her research page in the show notes. And also you can find Soraya on LinkedIn. It's Soraya-Afzali. Want to be sure to thank several of our partners and sponsors who make our podcast series possible, as well as the broader community building and regeneration renaissance work that we're doing through our global network at the Why on Earth community. And this includes Chelsea Green Publishing, Profitable Purpose Consulting, Purium Organic Superfoods, Dr. Bronner's, Patagonia, Earth Coast Productions, Waylay Waters, and of course, want to give a huge shout out to all our friends at the Le Ciel Foundation. Happy that we also have a podcast with the co-founders of Le Ciel, our friends Olivier and Sophie. And want to be sure also to thank our many ambassadors in our growing global ambassador network. And especially folks who have signed up for our monthly giving program to help underwrite the Why on Earth Community Podcast. If you haven't yet signed up for a monthly donation, you can go to whyonearth.org and go to the support page and set it up at any level that works well for you. If you'd like to give at the $33 monthly level or greater, as a thank you, we'll send you a jar of the Waylay Waters hemp-infused, biodynamic hemp-infused aromatherapy soaking salts within the United States for shipping to help with your self-care relaxation practices. And of course, we now have a Patreon page, and you can go to Why on Earth Community on Patreon and find a variety of gifts and offerings according to whatever level you'd like to support on a monthly basis. Finally, just want to encourage you, if you haven't yet joined our ambassador network and you would like to, you get access to a variety of additional resources, including our behind the scenes segments with our podcast guests. And after Soraya and I finish our main interview, we will spend some additional time together in our behind the scenes segment that is made available exclusively to our ambassador network. So a huge thanks to everybody making this series possible. And Soraya, a huge thanks to you for the work that you're doing. I think from a certain perspective, we can look at history as a beautiful and diverse tapestry woven by threads of many people striving for the good and striving for working in service to humanity and to the environments that we share together. And of course, throughout history, there are many, many examples of the violence, the bloodshed, the suffering, the hatred that can get mobilized through human leadership. And your earlier comment reminds me of the scene where basically George Washington was presented with the opportunity to be president for life, for the rest of his life, and he refused. And maybe many folks look at that moment as a moment when something very special was made possible in the imperfect but directional striving of the democratic system represented by the United States of America. And of course, he at that point in time could have said, yeah, I'd love to be president for life. I wonder, Soraya, and I'm not necessarily expecting that you can answer this for us, but what is it, in your opinion, that causes a leader like that to refuse the unbridled, virtually unlimited power? And apparently there's the saying that the King of England, upon hearing this story and asking about George Washington's whereabouts and hearing, he had gone back to his farm and was farming, that the king responded by saying, well, that's the most powerful man in the world. What are your thoughts on that? What's going on there in that inner alchemy of the leader that can end up in an authoritarian, violent situation, or can put in motion forces for goodness, for humanity?
Yep. Yeah, I need to look that up and include it in my research. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, that is a good question. And the only thing that comes to my mind is greed and ego and elements of narcissism. That unfolds in here. And there is a lot of studies psychologically done in the field about narcissism and leadership, and I think this is where it lies, that how our leaders, how a potential leader can navigate that, and to how far of an extent are they willing to go to feed this this narcissistic approach to life. And I think at the end of the day, this is something that is imposed on us by our system. We are in a lot of ways part of this whole setting as well. If we take our politics and our that has ended up in the way that it has, and a simple example of that would be capitalism, and how greed has been used in capitalism, how the idea of wanting more and more and never being enough is an instrument of capitalism. This is how it's fed. And so it is obviously like a human, human element, that exists within us that needs to be unpacked and paid attention to simply, understand that what we already are in abundance of many things that, we ask for, whether that is, power or material or however it unfolds in our life. And understanding that is something that is not taught to us as kids, as children, and it's only now, in this, era that we are questioning that. Okay, how capitalism system works. Why have we ended up in this, like, political system that constantly, no matter how many laws and policies are put in front, it still marginalizes, it still backfires, and it's designed that way. It is a massive system designed for these things to function the way they do. And one point of, stopping this is, again, asking this difficult question continuously, and going for asking the big question, but also small questions, and encouraging those with our younger generation, with our children, even more so. So this is how we can have a change of, hearts. So yeah, and I think the president of United States, when said something like that, obviously has already understood this element of, the joy of simple things, of being happy, of, that agreed is something that can never be fulfilled or filled in some ways.
Absolutely, yeah. It is reminding me of something John Rogers said when we recently had John on the podcast. He's the author of the Renaissance Campaign, of course, central to the work being done at the Luciel Foundation. And he said, power changes people. And I'm struck by that. I think there's a deep inquiry there. And I'm also struck by your mentioning of children and narcissism. I have come to understand in the mental health arena that there's more understanding that often when people end up exhibiting narcissistic behavior, that it is tied to and perhaps the result of childhood trauma or other trauma that hasn't been addressed and healed and mitigated and so forth. And so there's a very strong correlation there, at least as I understand it. And I wonder, ways in which we as a society, we as community leaders might think about helping to mitigate that directionality. I think so many of us, of course, have experienced so many types of traumas through our lives. And it seems, to me, one of the ways we can help heal our societal structures and systems is kind of back to your earliest point about home within, right? Sort of starting at ground zero, as it were, starting at the interior of our own selves. And I'm wondering if you've thought much about ways we might help to do that at scale in society.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very glad that the topic of trauma is coming up in our conversation, and it is something that exists on a larger scale, unfortunately, in our society. And trauma, it directly links to again a sense of belonging and identity as well. Oftentimes there is a part of us that's been traumatized from whatever it is, and oftentimes that stage is a loss of a something. For example, for me, a loss of country, it has its own traumatic implication, and the Afghan generation, in my generation, are also going through this collective trauma, that we have to face. Um, and it contributes to a sense of identity, and when we reflect on the connection of trauma and identity, we come back to the sense of belonging, and this is why belonging should be encouraged more. Belonging in society, contributing to contributing to inclusionary policies that do not backfire within, our systems that we function with. And So this is part of, what I have to answer to this. And another thing about um, trauma is also an element that I talked about, this fragility of, being influenced by charismatic authority. A big part of that is trauma, because an unresolved trauma give more chances to be influenced by charismatic authority, for good and for bad, and if it is on the good side, it's good. But the challenge arises when this sense of being offered in the bad spectrum of this charismatic belonging. And again, circling back, radicalization has also um, um, has a lot of connection and connotation that has to do with trauma. Um, the trauma of, racism, the trauma of any kind of hate, um, the trauma of being excluded, the trauma of being threatened to be yourself. All of these, again, feeds back to a state of fragility that is open to adapt to what is there, that is offered to us. Um, so we just, I think we need to create spaces that encourage a positive sense of belonging, and this is easier than we think. If we pay attention to our collective goals as cities, as communities, as on how can we be better citizens, how can we function better in our community, from our home to our street to our little village to our city and then country, and forget about all these borders and cliches and stigmas that are attached to our old narratives, then I think that's a very good place to start with. And there's a lot of initiatives that already does this. Here in Ireland, we just working on garden communities that bring people together, that become spaces of creativity, but also conversation about difficult things among people from one that has ended up on one street. And I think it is those spaces that people can start to feel the belonging in a community, in a community and diverse way, in a rich way.
I love it. I love it. I love hearing about the garden community concept, because there's so much going on there with the microorganisms affecting our neuro-biochemistry when we're interacting physically with the soil ecosystem, and bringing people together to have conversations in what is usually a pretty safe, relaxing environment. How beautiful.
Yep.
I want to mention, we've had a few other really extraordinary guests on the podcast talking about some of these topics, and including, I want to mention Dr. James Gordon, who's doing work to heal trauma in the entire nation and society of Ukraine in the midst of war. The conversation we had with him was really extraordinary. Also with Dr. Anita Sanchez, especially regarding trauma as it relates to some of the indigenous cultural experiences, and also women's experiences in particular. And of course, Dr. Sanchez is on the board of Pachamama Alliance, as is John Perkins. I want to mention John Perkins, who writes extensively about some of the systems and structures in place in the global cultural and economic fabric that need to transform, need to evolve. Can't help but mention our forthcoming book called Our Biggest Deal that we're putting together with a number of authors on this topic. And so stay tuned. We've got an essay from John Perkins in there looking at the difference between life economy and death economy, which, Soraya, I want to ask you about in a moment because it's something you've identified in your work. Want to also mention Dr. Jandel Allen Davis, an extraordinary leader who has been on the podcast twice talking about her work as a medical doctor and executive of a hospital, and also she's on the board of the Federal Reserve. And we did our second episode with her after the murder of George Floyd. And Dr. Jandel Allen Davis is an African-American woman and has shared such a raw and vulnerable part of herself in the days following that incredible tragedy. So I wanted to mention that as well. And finally, also the work of Dr. Robert Cloninger, and he's looking as a psychiatrist and a geneticist at some of the fundamental attributes making up each of us individually, determining and or indicating our likelihood to be concerned about all of humanity or people outside of our sphere, people we don't know, versus those of us not so concerned, more kind of tribalistic in our orientation. And I'm really curious, I want to follow up and ask Dr. Cloninger if they've done any correlating or deeper research looking at trauma as it might play out in the matrix that they've developed in their research. And he's one of the most cited scientists on the planet alive right now. So really exciting that we have the opportunity to weave some of these expertise and perspectives together. And coming back to this life versus death orientation that John Perkins writes about in terms of economy, Soraya, I'm really curious because you and I spoke a few weeks back about this in the rhetoric, right, of some charismatic authoritarian leaders, and I was hoping you could elucidate this for us.
Yep, absolutely. I think what comes to my mind in relation to charismatic authority, and part of my research is the concept of necropolitics that is developed by Mbembe, and necropolitics basically explains in a nutshell that we live in a world that is almost like a death world. And to clarify this further, for those of listeners who are familiar with the gaming world, a death world is a place where is not friendly to life. You can step on a plant and you might die, or you can be eaten by anything. So that's a death world. And Mbembe comes forward and explains that, how our world is systematically designed, that our worth is connected to the value of our death, in fact. For example, a person in Europe might have a better quality of life, or in certain cities, and deserves, certain social benefits by the government depending on what they earn, and so many other contributing factors. And then they deserve a good life. But for somebody who is on the other end of the country and lives a slightly rough life, this person, benefits from lower quality of life. And therefore their life is not worth it as much as the person A.
Mm.
And this is how the politics of the necropolitics works. And this is mentioned by Mbembe as the politics of death. And when we take this analysis further in relation to refugees and immigrants, we can see this quite explicitly, even more. A refugee is scrutinized from the beginning to the end. There is They're placed in refugee camps that uh, whose movement is monitored, as well as their nutrition, as well as their life, as well as their clothing, and anything about them is monitored. And therefore, a refugee becomes a subject to the politics of death. And if this refugee receives the lowest quality of life, it doesn't matter because the refugee is the refugee. It's the value that has been attached to the bodies of a refugee is the lowest in a country that is receiving them. And again, this is how the politics of death, works. But it even goes further, it goes deeper within the structural system. And I want to give an example of the direct provision here in Ireland, where there are refugees who have been in this complexes for years. Some people have been there for 10 years. Some people gave birth to a child in these complexes. And all because of their refugee status, their asylum seeking status, their inability to get jobs, these barriers that has existed and has prevented them to get out of this refugee system here in Ireland. But even further than that, these complexes have been privatized, meaning that there are companies that provide
Mm.
food for these complexes, that
Yes.
there is a system of allowance that is very little, and anything, from 30 euros per week in this very expensive country is the allowance that for the direct people living in direct provision. And the privatization of this big system in itself builds an economy. It further stabilizes this system in place. It makes it hard to move because now there is a revenue, there is a flow of money that is backing this political system that is in place. So this is again comes back to the value that is attached to the bodies of people who have been othered, people who are immigrants, who are refugees, and so forth. And this is why I think following our conversation, I find this concept of necropolitics quite fascinating because it also explains that these certain values that are attached to bodies functions through elements of race. It functions through elements of religion. It functions through it almost creates a mega system that nobody no longer dares to talk about it.
Mm.
It just is.
Mm.
It's just how it has been. Um, and when it becomes privatized, when it has economic backing, then this vicious cycle of racism and hate and vicious cycle basically keep on going. It continues. um so yeah, and like I I connect this in my research and in relation to charismatic authority in a way that, why do we need to be careful about this particular type of authority? Why do we need to pay attention how we are being manipulated, how we are being offered a sense of belonging, and so forth? Because this type of authority becomes political, and political leadership creates these systems. They become the point of decision making for these systems. It definitely takes, our parliament members, our political leaders, to make the will of this kind of politics to move around. Um, and and this is why, individual leadership, charismatic leadership, who do we how we work and how we communicate, how do we understand our sense of agency and what do we do with it, becomes significant in this process, in uh, this whole structure, systemic structure that we're part of.
Mhm. Absolutely. Your mention of the privatization of refugee camps makes me think about the privatization of prisons here in the United States. This has been an extraordinarily widespread and unjust structural system, obviously affecting black men of color to a much higher degree than virtually the rest of society. And in many of these instances, these folks are given opportunities or required to work for companies that are making profits, but are getting paid maybe 25 cents an hour, maybe $1 an hour. It's virtually a slave labor system. And when we think and look at, something like the Nazi regime, of course, those folks mobilize that with hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of imprisoned people forced to work. And what's not talked about quite as much around the Holocaust and the Second World War is that there was basically a Nazi aristocracy that profited immensely from that system. And I think part of the issue around all of this, Soraya, has to do with transparency and shining light on the places in our structures and systems where if you've got a misaligned profit motive, it seems to me it's very hard to get the people benefiting from those injustices to voluntarily give that up. That doesn't seem to be a pattern that happens too terribly often. And so I think for us as a whole, the transparency and the education is really critical so that we have our eyes open as to what's really going on in these instances.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think, overall, my goal with this type of research, I know I kind of have touched upon in different, segments of areas, from starting from Taliban to like far right in Europe, and these big systems that we have. Um, my goal is to shed light on this process, to shed
Mhm.
light that, okay, um, how did we like end up in here, and to be honest, as a PhD candidate students, it has not been easy. It's a constant struggle, but um, just only because all of these things are super connected, there is always, for example, this privatization, as you mentioned, that backs certain political agenda, and it makes it move forward, and I hope to shed light on these processes, and then again, coming back to education, which is the group that I work with, Le Ciel Foundation as well. There is a lot that can be done through our educational system, and that um, it starts with how are we training, people to be part of these big systems that we just talked about, whether that is prison or corporation or politics? How are we training people, to fit into these very fixed standards of profession? And why is that? Who are we? And I think this question of um, rather letting people to be to follow this sense of purpose within themselves and approach that from an external perspective is the job of the education. And to constantly again question these systems, these big systems that have even curated our educational system, to change perceptions and carry on. And I want to, like, again, from politics to economy to education, the change of perceptions happen, it's not a massive process. It's not like, oh my god, this is a big system, I cannot do anything about it, and so forth. No, we can actually. And this is as simple as somebody being nominated for the parliamentary system and having an agenda for different purposes that that encourages these systems to go further, versus somebody who comes forward and propose a type of leadership that is a eco leadership, that is based on a eco mindset, that helps some of the challenges of, for example, climate change and so on to be resolved. I think it's those decisions that happens on macro level that that is quite impactful. And the same thing goes on to our educational system, that why do we not, at the end of the day, put some of our global challenges that is not even specific to one country as the center of our educational system, and approach our educational system from there.
Mhm.
And if any institution prevents this, says a lot about them than the other way around. And I think it's these change of perspective that we need to focus on and encourage people to have. And again, these are not like massive impossible changes, they're quite practical. um so yeah.
Love it, absolutely love it, Soraya. And it reminds me of a saying. I forget who it's attributed to. About it goes something like, if you want to make small changes, change your habits. If you want to make big changes, change your perceptions. There's something in here that you're speaking to that I think is really exciting and empowering. And I want to thank you as we wrap up. And of course, you and I will still have a few more minutes together in our behind the scenes segment for our Ambassador Network. Just want to remind our audience, if you haven't yet joined the Ambassador Network and would like to, you are invited. You can go to whyonearth.org and click on the Become an Ambassador page to get that process and your journey started. All kinds of ways to connect, to build community, to shed light, to cultivate a sense of belonging with a whole bunch of us around the world doing good work. And before we transition to that, Soraya, I just want to thank you for the amazing work and research that you're doing, and for speaking about it in such a cogent and compelling way. And thank you for the ways you are shedding light in our world that is so needed. And before we wrap up our podcast interview discussion here, I want to just ask you one last question. If you could wave your magic wand and describe or prescribe a way in which we, humanity, could transform our world together over the next several years, What would you have us do? What would you ask us to do? What would you envision us doing?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you for having me today, and it's been a privilege speaking to you today. And I want to finish with one point, and that is to always focus on what we share, what is mutual between us, rather than noticing differences, and contributing to more separation. Um, I think what we share with each other, each one of us, um, is so exciting. It's so rich, and it has so much potential to be explored. And I want to finish with that.
That is so beautiful. I love it. Thank you so much, Soraya. It's been a real joy.
Thank you to you.
The Why on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit whyonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code WHYONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the whyonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Why on Earth community.